Good afternoon and welcome. As we wait for folks to continue to log on, I wanted to thank you for joining us today to discuss 100 years since women won the right to vote. I'm Rachel Rosen for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our board co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, whom we'll hear from shortly, on behalf of Mark Melman, our president and CEO, and our staff, welcome. We hope you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Stabler to introduce Ann, but first I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. If you like what you hear today, please do consider following us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. You can also go to our website, DMFI.org, and sign up for our news and updates. We're going to take questions today, and I encourage you to please ask them. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can submit them to the Q&A feature on the Zoom interface. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can type them into the comment section. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Stabler, DMFI board member. Megan?
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. It's incredible to think that American women on August 26, 1920, 100 years ago, actually got the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then it was fully secured in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for racial minorities. I'd like to thank you for joining us today about how American Jews and allies helped women win the vote. And really, really excited to be joined today to introduce our speaker and my colleague on the DMFI board, Ann Lewis. Ann is co-chair of the DMFI. She served as White House Director of Communications for President Bill Clinton and as a senior advisor to the campaigns of Hillary Clinton for Senate in 2000 and 2006, and when Hillary was running for president in 2008. In 2016, she was the co-chair of the Jewish Women for Hillary. From 1994 to 1995, Ann was the president for public policy of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She was previously chief of staff for then Congresswoman, later Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland. She's also the first woman to serve as political director of the Democratic National Committee, and Ann was a member of the Rules Committee for the 2016 Democratic Convention. She's been a Richmond visiting professor at Rutgers University and a fellow at Harvard's Institute for Politics and the Annenberg School of the University of Pennsylvania, and is also a member of the board of Zioness and the Center for U.S. Global Leadership. So I'm totally thrilled. The word I'm going to use is stoked to hear from Ann today. So please join me in welcoming Ann Lewis. Take it away, Ann. Thank you.
Megan, thank you so much. And I have to say to everyone in the audience, what a pleasure it is to work with you, and most recently in your leadership on the platform committee. Always joy. So let's talk about suffrage. And I think I'm going to start by asking Rachel if she wants to kick it off with some questions. But as we begin, I want to make this one point. So the suffrage movement, and as you just heard, we're celebrating 100 years of women's vote today. 100 years ago from today, the 19th Amendment, which ensured women the right to vote, gets incorporated into the United States Constitution. And that is after years of struggle and fight and referenda and lobbying, and you can imagine. Suffrage was both a social reform movement and a political campaign, because that's how we changed the laws in this country. And while the 19th Amendment removed sex as a barrier to voting, as we all know, there were regions of this country in which race continued to be a barrier, and that doesn't go away, if you will, and does not vanish until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But we're here today to celebrate the fact that women voting, the women's vote, 100 years of women's vote, and by the way, the last election, presidential election I saw, there was something like 10 million more women than men who cast their ballots, and I'm looking forward to a similar number this year. Rachel.
Thanks so much, Ann. Thank you, Megan. And a reminder to folks, we would love to take your questions, so please submit them through the Q&A feature. If you're on Zoom or if you're on Facebook, you can type it into the comments box. So Ann, thank you also for that great preview about what we're going to talk about today. But can you start by talking to us about what were some of the key elements or the key factors that made this movement a success?
It's very interesting because, as I say, more than 100 years ago, obviously, 100 years of suffrage, of women voting, but 70 years before then of making the case about why women should vote. So how do we get there? Yes, it was a social reform movement. Yes, we have seen pictures of parades and of women, again, picketing the White House. But the bottom line is it was political campaigns, state by state. And to my DMFI friends, colleagues, anyone watching, you know what that is like. That's hard work. That's winning votes one by one at a time. And as you begin to do that, you have to think, what's the message? It's not here around a candidate. This is not a single person that we're talking about. We're talking about the rights of women, or another way to put it, we're talking about asking men, who are the only voters now, we're asking men to share their power. That is not easy. I think any of us would think, okay, I'll ask the men in my family, they'll be fine. Now go out in the street and ask a couple of strange men, say you'd like to share his power. He might take a while to convince. So let's talk about what were the messages? What was the political strategy? First, from the very beginning, the first strategy was citizenship. We are citizens, the women said, and therefore we should have the rights of citizens. Susan B. Anthony said, it is we the people who wrote the Constitution, we the whole people, not we the male citizens, not we the white male citizens, but again, everybody. Well, those are stirring words. They were not very persuasive. From in the 1860s, the end of the Civil War, 1868, suffrage gets going in some of the Western states. You have 4 states between the end of the Civil War and the suffrage movement kicks off to the beginning of the 20th century. And those are Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. That's it. So again, nice language, stirring language, if you will, but not persuasive. Fortunately, something else is happening. By the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we're now entering the progressive era. Progressive era in the United States means different expectations for government. Now people are talking about, writing about, speaking about, government has a responsibility to make sure the milk is pure, that children are safe, that women working in factories are safe. We can't do that by ourselves. We need government to help. And it is those expectations, those questions that not only engage women more, now they understand why the vote is important to them, it also makes the argument somewhat easier for men. We're not saying to men, share your power. We're saying to men, women need the vote to be better mothers, to be better stewards at the home, to meet their responsibilities. Here's an example, as you've heard. I collect some of the material that suffrage has used. I hope you can read this. It says, not at home. You were not at home today. Some say women's place is in the home. We say you might have been at your children's school, and then under it, politics controls the school. You might have been buying your dinner underneath. Politics controls pure food laws and market conditions. And then it goes through, you might have been buying ready-made clothing. Politics controls the conditions under which they are made. You might have been seeking a position under which you could support your fatherless children. So those are the reasons why you should care. And I think that flyer speaks to me because I've never been in a door-to-door canvass where I wasn't handed a stack of why you're out cards, right? You leave those behind in the doors where the voter, nobody answers the door and you stick your little card in. This is from 1917. This is more than 100 years ago. Here's a why you were out card that both says we tried to reach you, but also says, here's why you should care. And here are the arguments on why women should want the vote and why women should have the vote. And it's wrapped around their responsibilities as mothers, as families, as citizens. Here's another example. This one is headlined, to the 8 million working in the United States. And you know that that headline was picked for value. Yes, women don't just stay at home and knit, thank you or so. 8 million women are out working. They're working in factories. They're working, making the garment trade. Here's what they need. They need safe working conditions. Remember, we're just a few years past the Triangle Fire. where so many young women and some men were horribly burned and killed because of the unsafe conditions, because the doors of that factory were locked to keep the workers in and the union organizers out. So again, working women need the vote. Another example, we're getting here, teachers need the vote. It talks about why teachers, and women teachers, by the way, by law, paid far less. Teachers need the vote to have more schools and better schools. So you see, again, a very targeted, serious campaign that's saying to people, here's how the vote will make a difference in your lives. Here's why it's worth looking for. Basically, in this era, in these years, voting goes from being something that women have a right to, as I've said, didn't succeed as well as we might have liked. Voting is now something women need to meet their responsibilities. That becomes much more successful. And again, a message that easily appeals to men as well as women. Remember, it's not just all your swing voters were men in these elections. All the voters you had to reach were men. So the progressive message about meet your responsibilities, be a better mother, take care of your children is very powerful. And that's what starts working in the first half of the first decade, really, of the 20th century. There's a subset here. So that's from 1900 to 1917. In 1917, America is getting ready for war. And this is a really hard, as you can imagine, for a country that has not been in war, that has never been in a world war. This is a hard choice for a lot of the suffrage leaders. Many of them identified with peace. Carrie Chapman Catt had been was head of the Suffrage Association and a member of the Peace Party, but she gives it up. She says, we can't have both. We have to be seen as being on the side of the American people. And now you've got a new message, and I'm going to hold this one up. Suffrage, here we go, suffrage as a war measure. And now in 1917, as the nation prepares for war, the suffragists say, how can we help? We can sell war bonds, and they do. We can plant victory gardens, and they do. We can join the Red Cross. We can help pay for ambulances. The suffragists not only are good, hardworking citizens on the side of the war effort, but they want to be sure to be seen that way too. This is a different version of meeting your responsibilities as citizens. Now, at this point, we're all Democrats here, so you will not be surprised that there are some disagreements about tactics at this point. A smaller group, originally called the Congressional Union, then the National Women's Party, disagrees with the suffragists who want to go all in to be helpful on the war. They're out there picketing the White House, and they're not going to stop picketing the White House just because Woodrow Wilson, the president, is leading the nation to war. In fact, they get more and more aggressive. The crowds push back harder and harder. And so some of the really worst pictures you see, worst examples you see of attacks and violence against suffragists are around this time, 1919. They are seen as being disloyal and unpatriotic. They continue, they do not give up. And finally, the reaction against the violent treatment, there's a real counter-reaction and subsides and the women are freed. But meanwhile, the larger organization, NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, does not stop there selling the war bonds, planting the victory gardens, being helpful and supportive. And in the end, you'd have to say their tactics were probably the most successful, because now the advertisements say, women have shown they deserve citizenship. How can we deny it? Even Woodrow Wilson held back on suffrage as long as he possibly could, finally goes to Congress and say, look how women have been supportive. Look at how they've been active citizens. They are entitled to the vote. So I'd say those are the stages of the suffrage message.
Great. And can you talk to us about the role Jewish Americans played in the movement?
Well, happy to. This is the one that absolutely fascinates me. Like many of you, I'm spending a lot more time at home these days, and I've been doing a lot more reading and following up on some books and notices I hadn't really gone all the way down. And one of the questions that really stuck out to me was the high degree of support for suffrage in New York, especially New York City, in 1915 and again in 1917. And what did that mean? So let's start with we're in 1915. Suffrage is now in a tough place, let's say. The suffrage referenda have lost in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. 4 big Eastern states, suffrage loses in all of them. As they look to go forward, what are the next steps? The only possibility is New York, because it's, again, the only place in which the state law allows you to bring that vote back within 2 years. Now, there is some nervousness about this. New York is a city with a lot of immigrants. And just as we've been seeing a debate about immigrants for political purposes this year, there were some, again, nervousness about the number of immigrants who are coming in and were, in many cases, dominating politics of some of these Eastern cities. New York had 31% of the population of New York City by 1917 was Jewish. It was then, as it is today, one of the largest Jewish cities in the world. More than half the population of New York City was foreign born. And the suffragists were quite nervous, a little uneasy about what the reaction would be. But it was the largest state in the Union. New York at that point had 45 electoral college votes. So you can't ignore it. You can't win a national referendum and can't win a constitutional amendment nationally if you do not win some of the big Eastern states, and New York was the prize. And they go ahead and they dive in. First election, as we've said, the first referendum is in 1915 and they lose, but they don't stop. 2 days later, they have another suffrage meeting, raise more money and get right back into it. When the polls close in 1917, New York State has voted yes for suffrage. This is a huge step forward, and it is entirely because of the votes cast within New York City. And within the city, it is because of the votes cast in those Jewish districts. Here's some numbers. The total votes cast in New York State in 1917, 1,303,905. The referendum, suffrage referendum, loses outside the city by 1,510 votes. So narrow loss, but a loss of 1,500. Even Rochester, which is the home of Susan B. Anthony, which has been so proud of Susan B. as their, again, leading stateswoman, even Rochester votes no on suffrage. But the margin inside the city, suffrage wins by 103,000. That is entirely the margin for the state. And where do those votes come from? 78 of the top 100 pro-suffrage districts are the Jewish districts. Within those Jewish districts, and again, a lot of them were immigrants. Those Jewish voters weren't born there, if you will, they'd come. But within those districts, 76 to 93% of the votes were yes. So if you have 78 districts with a margin of anywhere from 76 to 93% in an area covering 31% of the vote in the city as a whole, that's where your margin of 103,000 comes in. And that's really a stunning number, which has the effect, once New York votes, once those 45 electoral college votes are now in the pro-suffrage pocket, if you will, side, you can imagine the impact that has on any national candidate when you look around and you're thinking of running for president next time, whatever you're voting for, it's a big, strong signal. So my second question is why? Why did the Jewish vote in New York come out so heavily? Here's what I think we are. One, this is a well-organized campaign built on the 1915, as you've heard me say. They didn't stop. They targeted outreach to neighborhoods and constituencies. There was lots of attention to Jewish districts, lots of campaigning in Yiddish. And let me give you 2 examples. Whoops, all right. I'm gonna have to stretch, excuse me a minute. Here we go. Here, by the way, here's an example of the New York campaign. These are paper cups. If you want something that everybody's going to use and see, here's one. But if you want to see something that is targeted towards the Jewish vote, I've got a song sheet here in Yiddish. I'm not sure how easy this is to read. If you can see the cover, there is a lovely family. It's a multi-generational family. A young woman is playing. Grandpas and grandma are sitting and listening. There's a young man standing nearby. And the credits say words by B. Tomaszewski, sung by Mrs. B. Tomaszewski. The Tomaszewskis were the king and queen of the Yiddish theater in the early 20th century. They were sort of the Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton of their time, and their marriage actually wound up in the same place. But at the time, the fact that the Tomaszewskis would use their names and their credibility, if you will, on this is a good example of how important and how significant Jewish voters were committed emotionally as well as politically to the votes for suffrage. So that would be one, lots of attention, very targeted campaigning. Second, in the Jewish neighborhoods, the suffrage campaign worked with existing organizations. Some of that sound very familiar to anybody who's planning a campaign today. For example, the Henry Street Settlement Association. Henry Street, famous settlement association founded by Lillian Wald, who was the founder of public health nursing in New York. And if you go on Lower East Side of New York today, the Henry Street Settlement is still in business. It's serving a very different neighborhood perhaps, but they're still doing good work. Henry Street Settlement had a suffrage association. They had regular meetings. They gave presentations. They had parades and festivals. It was woven at this point, woven into their lives. So the settlement houses, the networks, trade unions, coalitions with trade unions were very important. I talked a moment ago about the Triangle Fire, 146, mostly women, some men, young immigrants, burned to death. A terrible tragedy because the factory was unsafe. Rose Schneiderman, who is a young immigrant from Poland, speaks at the memorial service. She says later, she doesn't know what she said because she never wrote a speech. Her heart poured out, and the New York Times wrote what they said she said. So that's what we all think she said. But Rose Schneiderman, a leader now in the union movement, then takes a year or two to go organize for suffrage. She says, I think I was born a suffragist, but if I hadn't been, the conditions of working women would make me one. So the garment trades, the cigar workers, the unions that had the heaviest concentration of Jewish workers, strongly for suffrage. For them, the more power, the more votes their members had, the more power they would have, the better their chances for a better life. Other leaders who were visible and vocal, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, who is commemorated to this day in New York with a synagogue in his name, becomes one of the co-founders of the Men's League for suffrage. And he doesn't just lend his name, he marches in the parades down Fifth Avenue. Rabbi Wise tapes a radio speech, which I guess is new media for the time, on why women voting is essential for full democracy. So you had trade union members, you had leaders, you had organizations and networks, all supporting suffrage, all saying this is important to us, this is going to mean a better life, this is what democracy is about. And I believe that's why those votes came in as heavily as they did.
Wow. Fascinating, Anne. I'm going to go to try and take a couple of questions that were submitted here. We have a question from Deborah. She says, thanks so much. Did you say that women teachers were paid less than men by law? That's amazing. Please elaborate.
Not only were women teachers paid less, but I will have to go back and find the year. Susan B. Anthony is for a while a teacher. She eventually becomes a full-time suffragist. She gets up at a meeting of teachers and says to this group, don't you realize that so long as women are treated worse, your whole profession will not get the respect. Our whole profession will not get the respect we deserve. He says later, one man comes up to her, she's not sure what he's going to say, and he says to her, before my wife spoke like this, I would rather she were in her coffin. So yes, it was taken for granted that women teachers would be paid less than men. And challenging that as challenging the norm in many things met a fierce reaction.
Wow. And you have this extensive collection of suffragist memorabilia. Can you take us back and how did this start? Where's a lot of your material housed? And what really made you interested in this?
Well, 30 odd years ago, very odd, I was walking through a flea market in Faneuil Hall, you'd say, and I saw, I guess I was stopped and looking, and I'm always looking at old paper and books, and there was a piece of paper, a flyer that said Suffrage Bazaar. And it was signed, not personally, but signed in print by Julia Ward Howe and 4 other women. And they were appealing for donations that they would sell at their suffrage bazaar. So this is a time when I'm working with my friends, it's what we called them the second wave of the women's movement. I thought, I know what they're doing. They're trying to raise money so they can print materials, so they can go out and speak, so they can, again, persuade. So how do you move society forward? You do it with organizations, with movements. That's what they were doing, just like what we're doing now. And I bought it. It was very inexpensive. I have to say there was very little interest in suffrage at the time, and brought it home. And after that, whenever I went to an old book fair, to a junk shop, to a flea market, I would sort of nose around and see if they had anything that said suffrage or women's votes. And for a while, we had a pretty successful run at it. I must say, eBay has sort of conquered that market now. And the joy of walking through old bookshelves is not quite what it was, although I'll still try. But that's how it began. And the more I found, the more interested I got, and the more I began to see the patterns, especially of what worked and what didn't. And the more I thought, this is what campaigning is like. This is what we do now. Look what they did. They did it without radios, certainly without television. They did it without mass media or very much money. Women in New York, when in those 1915, 1917 referendum, they were going up and down the stairs in tenements to talk about what was at stake. They were wearing more clothes on one day than I wear in a week, right? But they got it done because that's what you needed to do to connect. Let me add couple of examples here of the kind of material I've found that really helps me tell the story. Here's a postcard that says, why not let Mother vote? And here you have Mother. She's this very appropriate, dignified woman. She can't get in there to vote, but some really scruffy men are going in. So that's one way they tell the story. And remember, as my friend says, postcards were the Gmail, or the email, I guess, of their time. They were inexpensive. You could send a penny postcard. That was how you talk to your friends. Here are some examples of postcards that use children as speakers, because, you know, little girls on a postcard can be much more forthright, if you will. Whoops, that was two of a kind. But here's another example of a postcard. Has that patriotic ring to it, but with toddlers. And on the back, I hope, because this is, someone wrote that message to her friends, I hope you are in favor of votes for women. Suffrage is surely coming. So again, we were, as we went looking, finding more and more different kinds of examples. And where do we put them? I've got to say, I ran out of walls some time ago. For the first set, I sort of framed and hung on the wall. That old suffrage, women's suffrage bazaar flyer is on the wall. Several notebooks. Some of them look like this. with, of course, acid-free paper. And we do it in, got it. So we've got notebooks on the bookshelves. We have a cabinet with china pieces, basically anywhere I can.
That's fascinating. And my colleague Jake has shared the website that talks more
good.
about Anne's collection and may even host some of the materials there. He put that in the chat. And so I'd like to turn to voting rights issue and what's going on today. And we have a question from Facebook that asks, how can we expand voter participation across all Americans?
Well, that is so important, and I'm so glad it came up. One, what's chilling is to realize we're in the same fight again. The arguments against suffrage were that somehow there was this group of people who didn't know enough to vote. We shouldn't make it so easy for people to vote, that are really better educated people who had the most at stake should be the voters. And when you go back and look at the fight against suffrage, there was an op-ed in today's New York Times by Elaine Weiss, who wrote one of the best books about suffrage, The Woman's Hour. And she says, why did it take 1 week from August 18th, when the 19th Amendment was ratified in the Tennessee House, until August 26th, which is the date we celebrate today? Why did it take 1 week for it to be incorporated into the Constitution? And the answer is because the anti-suffragists, the people opposed to expanding voting rights, used every trick they could think of to delay it. They tried to leave the states so there wouldn't be a quorum for the legislature. They tried to repeal it, which turned out is not possible. It's the same thing today. We see legalistic tricks. We see legislatures trying to make it harder to vote. It's really stunning. The great victory of the 19th Amendment was that it was the largest expansion of our democracy on a single day in American history. We had more to do, but on that one day, we opened voting rights to so many people. Today, we have people who are openly trying to shut that back, to reduce the number of people who vote. So I'd say a couple of things. One, for anybody who's listening, check your own voter registration. Make sure it's valid. Make sure everybody in your family is registered. Two, check what the rules and practices will be in your state. We've just learned in our state, we're probably in our county going to have more drop boxes for the ballots. So write in if you can, if you know how, and if you don't find out how, write in for your ballot, figure out the safest way to, again, to get it to where it needs to go, whether it is a drop box or to a registrar, and then join the nearest campaign to ensure that we keep the voting rights full, accessible, open.
I'd love to get your take on Trump's attacks on mail-in voting, particularly during this health pandemic.
That's what's so stunning to me, that he just says it. They say that they don't even pretend that, to be open-minded about this. That, I guess in one way, the advantage is we don't have to decode it. This is not complicated. Donald Trump doesn't want people to vote by mail because that will increase the number of votes. He wants to control it. Just as 100 years ago, people in states in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, the bosses, if you will, the people who ran the political machines, didn't want suffrage because they didn't want to see all these new voters they didn't know. They don't want, Donald Trump and his Republican Party don't want voters they don't know. They don't want voters they can't trust. And it may be that they just have a pretty good idea that, again, women, people of color, that people who are lower income will not vote for them, given their record of the last 4 years. So they are openly campaigning, just like those legislators in Tennessee 100 years ago who tried to put up every possible roadblock to ratification. They're today trying to put up every possible roadblock. And we're gonna have to knock them down one at a time.
Here's another question, Anne. How did the movement grow so quickly from New York to so many other states? Were they the same messages or different tactics?
Right. First, the movement, remember, by the time it comes to New York in 1915, well, I've spent a lot of time in New York and I love it. It really is not the only state. By then, a lot of other states had in fact acted and voted. So that if you look at a map of the United States in 1915, you're going to see that voting starts in the West, like so many other great social movements. California, Washington, and Oregon all have suffrage by now. Moves across the Western states, gets to Illinois. Illinois votes for women's suffrage at presidential elections, if you will, and then some municipal elections. I think it's 1911. In fact, Ida B. Wells, one of the great heroines of the suffrage movement, as soon as Illinois votes for suffrage, knows exactly what to do with it. And she forms the Alpha Suffrage Club, and she organizes Black women in Chicago. And they, within 2 years, I believe, have elected the first Black alderman in Chicago. And that is because, again, Ida B. Wells was both a suffragist first and an organizer after. So you have suffrage moving through the Midwest, and then it hits the East. And those are the states, as I say, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Those are the states with the most embedded political systems. And these guys make their living at it, they're pretty good at it, but they were not excited about the idea of doubling their electorate. They'd spent a lot of time, if you will, and energy making friends with the voters they had. So they pushed back. And that's where, again, once New York went, and that's why that 1917 New York referendum was so important. Once New York went, not only did you have 45 electoral college votes, which again shifts the seesaw, if you will, the balance in the electoral college, but you have an example that Eastern voters, Eastern women can now vote, and other states are going to follow. I should add one more thing about the organized effort in New York between 1915 and 1917 that I think is a lesson to us all. In 1915, Tammany Hall, then again, a very powerful organization, for all the reasons I just talked about, opposes suffrage. 1917, however, the suffrage leaders really work, the leaders of Tammany Hall. Not only do they work the guys, a number of the wives of Tammany leaders are now appointed to positions as officers in the suffrage organization. And on the eve of the 1917 referendum, Tammany announces that they will be neutral. So sometimes some of the most significant acts in an election are what didn't happen. And the fact that Tammany chose not to oppose suffrage in 1917 was pretty significant.
And just a couple more questions, and then I'll ask you for some closing thoughts. Ruth asks, how can we use these tactics to gain equal pay legislation? Could you talk about some of the successful political tactics used in the suffragist movement and maybe how they can be applied to different political battles today?
So I'd say, think about what we just talked about. One, by making it clear to people, and equal pay does, why this matters to you personally. What difference will it make to you that you get equal pay? What difference will it make to other families that you get equal pay? Two, coalitions, and that's key. The fact that the suffrage women in New York work with the union women. So that you had the Women's Trade Union League, where women of every class, if you will, were working together. Three, show respect for people where they are. Yes, have flyers in Yiddish or Italian. Go into their neighborhoods. Don't expect them to come to you. When you put it together, that's how you build an electoral majority. And I would add, with equal pay, one issue, and I used to work in the Congress and had some experience with this. One issue is it's a little harder to explain. So that the equal pay laws are on the books. What we're now talking about is how do you enforce it and how do you make it real? And of course, we had the Lilly Ledbetter experience where she'd been working for what, 20 years at Goodyear? Didn't know she was getting paid less until one of her male colleagues slipped her the information because the company never made it clear. And then the Supreme Court announces that she's waited too long to sue. So the Lilly Ledbetter Act, fortunately, comes up in Congress, designed specifically to overturn that ruling. First time it is passed, it is vetoed by George Bush. And my dear friend and former employer, Senator Mikulski, gets up on the floor of the Senate and says something like, we're coming back. Square your shoulders, put your lipstick on, get ready to march, we're marching. Equal Pay Act passes. It is the first bill signed by President Obama. And I must say, he graciously gave that pen to Senator Mikulski, who's got it in a good place. But the key was, one, you don't give up. Two, you figure out where are the votes you need. And then three, you got to build the coalitions to get there.
Thanks, Anne. This is my final question from Facebook. Jenny asks, do you have a favorite suffragist?
Oh, gee. I have several, as you can imagine, but has to be, if I get one, it's Rose Schneiderman. Rose Schneiderman comes to the United States. She's 7 years old. And she's really excited about going to school. But soon after the family comes to the United States, her father dies. And then it's not possible anymore. And by the time she's 13, Rose Schneiderman goes to work in a factory. And she soon looks around and realizes that the men are getting better treatment because they're organized. And so she organizes a local of the Hat and Cap Makers Union. And as you can imagine, Rose moves up in the union ranks. She is one of the speakers at the Triangle Fire Memorial. After suffrage, maybe 1921, Rose Schneiderman has been working with the Women of the Trade Union League, because these are some middle-class women who help and support the union women. And one of the women she meets invites her to her house for a scrambled egg supper. And Rose goes along, and she meets her hostess's husband. This is this charming, amiable guy named Frank. He's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Rose Schneiderman is now friends with the Roosevelts. She may be the only person in the Roosevelt Brain Trust who really knows what it's like to work in a factory. FDR appoints her to several New Deal positions, but she always retains her working women, if you will, roots, and works. She is briefly the New York Secretary of Labor, where, by the way, she works for equal pay. She continues to play a role both in the lives of the Roosevelts and for working people. And this is a woman who was never, I don't think she reached 5 feet tall. When she gave speeches outside factories, she stood on a ladder, who comes to the United States speaking no English at 7 and winds up speaking around the world, if you will, and has the only memoir I've ever read that begins, "My friend Eleanor Roosevelt told me I should write this."
And if I could take another minute of your time, I did want to take one more question. Is that all right?
Of course.
Okay, great. We have a question from Richard. Did women begin to vote in states that had ratified the amendment before the amendment was fully ratified and became effective nationally?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, women began to vote as soon as the amendment took effect in their states. And I gave the example of Ida B. Wells in Illinois. So yes, we have, I would look back and find some other examples, but if you go back into the West, you will see women voting in California, in Washington, in Oregon, certainly in Illinois. Now it's a little slower. You know, if you grew up your whole life being told that ladies don't vote, that politics is not something nice women do, you might be a little less likely to vote. And that is exactly what happens. If you look at the patterns, the lines of voter turnout, women who of a certain age, let's say, had reached 21 or more before they had the right to vote, always throughout their lives, a little less likely to vote. Now those lines have changed like 20 years ago now. Now women are more likely to vote, which is where you get that 10 million vote margin for women voting. But yes, women began voting, well, two things. One, women began voting as soon as it was legal in their states. to Carrie Chapman Catt, who'd been this brilliant organizer of the suffrage movement, a year before ratification, sees it's coming and forms the League of Women Voters, because she knows, I think wisely, that women are more likely to vote if they're encouraged, if they think they know what it's about, and that it will be good for them to have as much information as possible. So the League of Women Voters actually begins before the amendment is ratified. And right away, you have women in New York, for example. I've got material from the New York chapter of the League of Women Voters talking about what legislation is up. Oh, by the way, the first vice president of the League of Women Voters in New York is a Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt. So some names do appear and reappear. They are lobbying, they are studying the legislation. And women from the suffrage movement, women who earn their spurs, if you will, earn their medals, going up and down those steps, getting signatures, standing at the polling places, urging people to vote. Many of those women now join the New Deal. So they're not just voting, they're joining soon after, as soon as they can. They're joining government to make a difference on the issues they cared about.
And thank you so much. This has really been fascinating. Personally, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to work with you at DMFI. I continue to learn so much from you. Thank you for walking us through your personal collection of this memorabilia. I wanted to see if you had any closing remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark Melman.
I think every day when I look at what those women went through, and their men, their male allies, when I look at how hard they worked, how much they sacrificed, and when you start, you know, you're being laughed at, and then people can be mean or cruel, didn't matter, they just kept going. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually in 1848 said that she was going to include the right to vote, asking for the right to vote in her resolutions at Seneca Falls, her husband, Henry, said he would be so embarrassed if she did that he would leave town. So she did, and he did. Now they got back together because they eventually had 7 children, but it was not easy from the beginning. When you ask for something, when you know you should have something that will make a difference, don't assume it will come with a pink ribbon on it or a blue ribbon on it or a gold ribbon on it. You just got to keep working for it. The second argument is, yeah, you get up every day and keep working and keep fighting, because sometimes you won't win. But for sure, if you walk away, you will never win. And if you get up and go back and build on what you've learned and keep going, you can do it. And I think the suffrage story is one of the great examples of American democracy at work. As women learned how to fight for the vote, as women achieved the vote, our democracy got stronger. That is, in fact, the history of the United States, starting with this small group of well-to-do white men. Every time we have expanded, every time our country has grown, we are better off, stronger, wiser, better able to take care of ourselves and our children and our future. And we got one more big opportunity coming up in 69 days, and now we got to use it. That vote is our power.
What a great way to end this important discussion. Thanks so much, Anne. I'm going to bring on Mark Melman, DMFI President and CEO, to close this out.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm trying to get on video here, but somebody's stopping me. Well, what an entertaining and important romp through vitally important history. Really, thank you, Anne, so much for those wonderful and educational remarks. It is incredible to me that my grandmothers of blessed memory grew up in a country where they could not vote. It's inconceivable to me, but it wasn't really that long ago when all was said and done. As Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. An example of that, but I will also say, as you did very eloquently, it only bends because people bend it in that direction. People worked hard to make suffrage a reality. We have that responsibility to continue to bend the arc of our country towards justice. One piece of that, of course, is the work that DMFI does to make sure that the Democratic Party succeeds, and the Democratic Party that succeeds is a party that is a pro-Israel Democratic Party. That's our core mission. For those of you that are not familiar with DMFI, we invite you to sign up on our website, our Twitter, and elsewhere. You can see what we're doing and get involved in what we're doing. It is an important struggle. We've had a lot of successes. We have some more primaries coming up where our DMFI PAC, our separate sister organization, is engaged in races to help Democrats.
You froze.
Some additional of those races. And of course, we have November coming up where we have a whole raft of pro-Israel champions that we protect against Republicans, and an ongoing battle to make sure that our country and our party remains a pro-Israel party. It's a cause that we've been prosecuting for the last year and a half at DMFI. We've had a number of great successes. We've had a few failures, but we can only do it because of your support, and we urge you to get involved if you haven't been, and thank you very much if you have been. And again, it is our great honor and pleasure to be chaired by Ann Lewis, and just tremendous talents we saw on display today in an incredible way that I'll never forget. So again, thank you, Ann, and thank all of you for joining us. And thank you, Rachel.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.